Hi, Jack.
I think you're going to want to hear what I have to offer you.
Picard. Welcome, my friends. We are gathered together today to discuss Star Trek Picard Season 3, Episode 9, the penultimate episode of both this season and this series as a whole. This one is entitled Vox. If you're new here or have just otherwise forgotten, be aware that spoilers are ahead and there are doozies this week. So if you don't want to be spoiled, this is your last warning. 3, 2, 1... on with the show. So if you remember from last episode, we finally ditched the Shrike, we finally ditched Vadic, and seemingly things were about to be revealed as far as the Jack thing. What's going on with Jack? What's behind the red door? Deanna Troi was getting in his mind. She was going to empath her way past those locks, and boom. End of episode. We had to wait a week. We waste no time in this episode actually getting to those answers, so fair play to the writers. They didn't make us wait anymore. And the final revelation, what a lot of people thought was going on, is finally revealed. That door is opened. Deanna Troi sees what's behind that door, and as a lot of people speculated, it turned out to be... whoops, wrong one. That's right, the Borg. Jack Crusher has the Borg in his brain. What's actually going on with that? Why is he linked to the Borg? Well, we're going to get into that. But I do want to touch on my theory video because I was partially right, partially wrong. It was the Borg behind everything. However, my thoughts were that it was actually going to be a disembodied version of Locutus trying to come back and remerge with Picard. Then we could have a Jean-Luc Picard versus Locutus of Borg endgame kind of dealing with that trauma and having Picard finally confront and put to bed all of those situations that he dealt with back then. Well, that probably would have been a fairly cathartic way to end the series. I don't know how plausible it really was, so to find out it's actually the real Borg, not the Jurati Borg from last season, but the original Borg, the Queen introduced in First Contact, seems to be behind everything here. However, Locutus is in play. Locutus is very, very front and center as far as how and why this happened. She calls Jack in this episode Vox because he is in essence the voice. Locutus was the speaker. Jack turns out to be the first organically born Borg as far as we're aware of. Obviously, Star Trek's a big place. There could have been other ones in history, but for our purposes, as far as the storyline goes in Alpha Canon here, he is the first bio-Borg that we know of. The changes the Borg made to Jean-Luc Picard back when he was assimilated were not just implants. They weren't just technological. They rewrote his DNA at a genetic level. They changed his genetic code. They made modifications in his very DNA, and that is what the Irumodic syndrome was. It was a biological way for him to communicate with the Borg. It was a bio-receiver, and this is the thing that they weren't able to detect at the time based on current technology. They had no way to reverse this. They misdiagnosed this as Irumodic syndrome, and what actually occurred here is because it was a genetic change on the most fundamental levels, this was now encoded in him, so much so that he was allowed to pass this on in the normal manner. So when he impregnated Beverly, that genetic material was passed along, and Jack Crusher, in essence, became the first biologically born Borg. That allows him all of these instilled connections to the Borg hive. If you can recall, there was all sorts of instances throughout Picard's life after this where he was still able to hear the collective, and that's because he was biologically connected to the hive mind even once he was physically disconnected. Jack is going through a similar thing. However, they explain here, Jack Crusher has a difference. He has a transceiver. He can transmit the thoughts. He can take over other people who are infected by the Borg, who are part of the Borg collective, who are part of the Borg hive. I still think this has something to do with the fact that in All Good Things, Q mentioned to Jean-Luc, you are the possible next step in human evolution. Whether or not he was aware of this at the time, that the changes the Borg made, obviously he was because he's omnipotent. Whether or not this is what's happening to Jack, I still think it might be. Yes, he's been changed by the Borg, but he's also had real human experiences. He's been raised as a human, and he wasn't part of the collective, so he doesn't have the scars of someone like Picard. He doesn't have the scars of someone like Seven of Nine. He's playing these things freely And I think he may actually be that next step. He's bridging the gap. And I think this is similar to what happened all the way back in TOS when Gary Mitchell is artificially evolved into the next version of humanity with those telepathic, telekinetic powers. That's similar to what's going on with Jack here, but I believe he has the skills and the capability to deal with these in a better manner because he's a one step up, more evolved person that's integrated and learned and grown. Here's where I'm going to have to give a little bit of a down, and this has nothing to do with this season of Picard. They have overused the Borg to hell. Season 1, Season 2 of Picard just really kind of threw them away. They didn't deal with them properly, in my opinion, and you can even go so far as Voyager, maybe a couple of the later episodes of TNG, really didn't use them effectively. So a lot of people are Borged out. Myself, I was Borged out. I was hoping it was something else. If you take TNG as a whole, plus the movies, and then skip directly to Picard Season 3, I think this works 100% effectively. It makes sense. We aren't really Borged out by that point, and everything here works as far as a character study of Jean-Luc Picard and an extension, the TNG cast, the TNG crew. Because we have to deal with the last 15 years of overuse of Borg, Season 1, Season 2 of Picard, it kind of falls a little bit flat if you're really trying to integrate all of these things into a coherent timeline and a coherent story. My advice to you would be ignore Season 1, ignore Season 2, and view this as an independent thing in a vacuum like it was potentially intended to be, and then it works as a follow-up to TNG in the movies in a much, much better way. They also did a lot of stuff in this episode to forward the momentum of the fleet. Very little mention of the changelings here, so I'm assuming Vadic is purely gone, and it was the Queen behind the changeling head. Since Vadic's gone, we're probably not going to see that floating hand, that floating head anymore, so I have to assume that was the Queen, and we'll get more revelations on that in the last episode. That remains to be seen. Potentially, Locutus could still rear his head, and that could be a final conflict. Still fingers crossed for that. But one thing that was very, very in this episode is we lost Shaw. We thought he was going to die 53 times before this. Obviously, everyone's been rallying for a Captain Shaw show, and while that's most likely not going to happen, I feel like his death played out exactly as I predicted in a few of my reviews. He was dying. His final words were to give command to Commander Hansen, except he finally calls her 7 of 9. Very touching moment. I'm sure this isn't going to happen, but 7 of 9 does hold the answer to bringing Shaw back if they were to go down this route. I don't believe they will, but as we saw in Voyager, her Borg nanoprobes can basically do any miracle the writers want that day. They have brought people back to life in worse states than Shaw. They have brought Neelix back a long time after his death, so this could be a very, very satisfying resurrection now that I believe they're doing it, because Shaw, who has spent most of his adult life hating the Borg because of the events of Wolf 359, has finally encountered them, died to them, kind of put those feelings aside as he's dying, is brought back by the very technology of the beings he has spent his entire life hating. I feel like that could be a good emotional through line for an ongoing series with Shaw, the Star Trek Legacy show that doesn't look to be very viable at this point. If that were to be the case, I think that could add a nice emotional wrinkle to the show down the line. Again, that's probably a pipe dream because there's no way they're actually going to do that. Just throwing that out there. Okay, a lot of other things happened here. We got a lot more references to classic TNG people. We got to see Shelby, the admiral in charge of these Fleet Day activities. The fleet is all interlinked, as we saw earlier, as this was mentioned throughout the season. Geordi hated this. The Borg have now infiltrated everything with the help of the changelings. Now all of these ships are under Borg control technologically and also biologically, because why the changelings were infiltrating Starfleet to begin with, especially taking specific key roles as transporter operators, and why a lot of the cast and crew were not interested in using the transporters, they reprogrammed them with Picard's genetic modifications, therefore making anyone who goes through the transporter integrated with his genetic Borg material, making them all kind of part of the Borg collective, biologically unaware. However, this only applies to people roughly human age 25 or less because of the development of the cerebral cortex or something. So this means the relics, the older people, are going to be the ones unaffected. This also means the older ships are the ones unaffected because they're not interconnected. And I find that A nice, touching kind of metaphor, I suppose, for the last outing of our crew. All the old people are the ones that are going to have to save the day from the young people, and I guess that's just a nice poetic symmetry to end the season, because starting off in TNG's Season 1, they were the young people. Now they've gone through their whole life, and they have to save the day once again. Oh, so I mentioned Shelby was back. She seemed to be killed. We don't necessarily have confirmation, but I'm pretty sure she's gone. We also got a lot more mentions in this episode of classic Trek characters. Specifically, we got a ship named Pulaski. We got mentions of Wesley by name, and later on, at the very, very poignant end of the episode, when they step foot on the Big D, they pull the Big D out, the original Majel Barrett voice is there as the voice of the computer. And that was wonderful. I mean, I didn't know I needed to hear that. I was fine with the fact that they were done with that. But just having that here, and it made sense because this is the Enterprise D that crashed on Viridian 3. It was rescued, obviously, because it made no sense for them to leave Starfleet technology laying on a planet for others to come around and find later on. It also makes sense they would recover Kirk's body at the same time. So all of this is finally coming together. The plots with the changelings really do kind of make sense, although I feel a little bit let down if this is the end of the changelings. We're not going to follow through on their storyline. Yes, I'm aware these aren't the real, actual founders. These were 9 changelings being held by Starfleet, so for them to not really be connected to the Dominion whatsoever actually makes sense, and I am 100% on board with them not using the power wraiths, not using Gul Dukat, not bringing back Sisko or Odo, because this, in essence, is a TNG conclusion series. Everything needs to tie back to our TNG characters, specifically Jean-Luc Picard. So while that would have made sense for the Star Trek universe as a whole, it wouldn't have made any real impact on Picard. Armus, sure, he could have because he was linked to Picard. Nagilum, lesser so, but yes, he is a character originating in TNG. To have this be the Borg, the entity, the beings that Picard was never able to fully overcome, his true nemesis, I suppose, just makes logical sense, even though I feel a lot of people are probably going to be let down by the way this was done. O'Brien, to me, is the last missing piece we need to truly bookend this series, because he was there in the pilot of TNG, he was there in the finale of TNG, obviously all of his time on DS9, so for him to appear in the last episode in any capacity, whether it be a cameo or truly as an integral part of the storyline, I feel like that would really lend the great bookending of this show. We already have lost a couple of ships. The Excelsior has been destroyed. We've lost Shaw. We've lost Shelby. The Enterprise E is confirmed gone because of events that had something to do with Worf. I'm still pretty sure these were the events depicted in the season finale of Star Trek Prodigy. If you haven't seen that, go watch it, because I have to believe that's probably linked to these events as far as the fate of the E. It wasn't explicitly confirmed, but I'm going to go ahead and say that's the truth. All of these things finally culminating, all of the ensigns, all of the cadets, all of the characters 25 and under, now in control of the fleet as organic Borg, all the ships interconnected with the Borg. The Queen is in charge of all of the Starfleet Armada, and that seems like our one team here on the Enterprise D, flying off to face this final challenge at Earth, controlled by the Borg. I mean, I don't know what could be more dire. And I have to be a little bit upfront here because I've been calling out my extreme hatred of Star Trek doing all of these galactic ending events. Sure, this is a high-stakes situation. This feels more like a movie, so I did just want to address that because I very much am not in line with all of the galactic ending events in Star Trek lately. Because this is such a final moment in the TNG version of the universe, I think this has to feel like an ending movie, like The Undiscovered Country of TNG or something along those lines. Another thing I really liked, these shuttles are not part of this interconnected network, because we saw earlier in the episode, Jack took a shuttle from the Titan, flew off to a Borg cube and confronted the Queen. That's where we left Jack. This was mentioned later on by Data. Shuttles aren't interconnected, so we could see a lot of characters escaping their various Borg-controlled vessels on shuttlecraft. This also allowed our characters to go and get into the D, so how many other non-regulation ships are there going to be that aren't part of this interconnected network? And are we going to see any more of the fleet ships, the old relics, come out? Probably not. I'm assuming they're not functional, and if we do, they already left the Fleet Museum here without boarding any of them, so I feel like that last-ditch battle between the Voyager, the Defiant, the Enterprise A, all of those things, most likely isn't going to happen. I feel like that would be a heck of a lot of fan service, and it would be great, but just having the D back with the original lighting and all of that stuff just made my heart sing, and I feel like a lot of people are going to feel that way, and a lot of people are going to just vomit hatred because it's nothing but fan service. I don't feel that's the case, but let me know what you think about that. The very final thing that just felt great to me is all of the characters on the D taking their old posts, including Geordi taking his original Season 1 position on the bridge. After he was promoted to Chief Engineer, he very, very rarely was seen on the bridge and not really in that position ever again, so this feels great just having them all back in their Season 1 positions. Aside from all the obviousness, there were great emotional scenes in this episode. Humor with Worf, humor with Data, especially that scene where he was basically saying, well, I hope we all die quickly, with that creepy smile on his face, but also a very nice emotional scene where he asked Picard if he could say something to make him feel better, and Picard says no, and then just he kind of puts his hand on Picard. That's a nice emotional scene from Data, who hasn't really been able to express those before. But what were your feelings on this episode? How do you think of all the reveals we've learned? Is this where you wanted it to go, or are you very disappointed in where it's going? And what do you think is going to happen in this finale? Leave all your thoughts below. Like, share, subscribe, tell me where you think it's going or how this is going to end. And until next time,
I will remember you.
No.